So now we'll be covering clumping. The way that Yeti's clumping works is by using fibers to clump other fibers too. So what we need to do is create the fibers that we want to use. So the way that we do that is we open up the graph editor, select our network, and then duplicate from the scatter to the comb node. And I'm gonna control B. So let's turn on the second network's comb node. So we want to drop the density of the fibers down considerably to use them for clumping. So let's hide the groom node and then make the scatter node active. And what we want to do is drop the density multiplier down. Now I'm noticing that we have a density multiplier of 25, which is pretty high. And the reason why we were working with this percentage is so that we can see a large number of fibers on screen. But now that we've gotten this far, we want to adjust the viewport density. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Turn on the comb node so that we see all the hair. And if we go into the attribute editor, under display, we're only seeing 1% of the total fibers. So let's turn that up to 100 to see what we'll actually see at render time. And with a density multiplier of 25, the density is incredibly high. So let's go back to our scatter node and drop this down to 1%. And this is, since we have 100% displayed, we are seeing the density that we will see when we render. So a value of 1 is pretty good. Now let's bring the viewport density back down to 1 so that it doesn't slow down our Maya scene. Now let's go back to the clump fiber setup. Let's drop this down to 1 as well, but let's turn on lock density. We'll notice that even at 100%, we're only seeing a considerably lower number of fibers. And the reason for this is that we have lock density on, but by locking the density down, it's locking the fibers to the points that we're seeing on screen. Let's drop the density down to, let's try a quarter, and let's play around with the seed to see if we get something that might work better for us. Okay, so let's go with this. So now what we want to do is create a clump node. The clump node's first input carries the groom through, and the second input is for the fibers that it'll be using to drive the clumping. So let's connect this and make the clumping node active. And now what we are seeing is the fibers from the first network clumped to the fibers of the second network. It's looking very 90s. So we can actually increase the density here, and we'll see that the clumping is a lot more broken up with smaller clumps. Now let's refine the clump settings to get more aesthetically pleasing results. So clumping settings are fairly straightforward. We have base attraction, which controls how much the fibers are gonna attach to the base of the clump fiber. Same thing goes for the tip. And then we have attraction bias. What attraction bias does is it favors how the fibers are attracted to the balance between the base and the tip. So if we were to set the base attraction to 0, so you can kind of play around with that until you find something that works for the groom. So now let's switch it to 1.5, set this to 0.9 so that the hair isn't fully attaching to a single point. Now another thing that I'm noticing is how the hair is forming at the clumps, and the reason for this is that the fibers may be longer, so they're crunching to the size of the clump fibers. If we go into the geometry tab, there's maintain length. So by turning off maintain length, the fibers that are being clumped aren't getting crunched to fit the length of the strand, and this will kind of cut the hair down to size. So play around with these settings. Now another thing that I'm noticing is hair along the part is giving us some weird clumping. The reason for this, I'm assuming, is if we slowly turn down the weight, we can see that hair on one side of the part is getting clumped to fibers that are on the opposite side of the part. So we'll come back to the part. Let's adjust the clump settings a little bit more. So we want to keep the tip attraction to a number lower than 1. I rarely have the clumping going to a perfect point. So the min and max distance, you're going to determine what the area of influence is. And as such, it's kind of averaging out the clumping. And that actually is looking pretty decent. Let's try the max distance of 0.5. And that's not bad. So let's go with this. Now we can add levels to the clumping. So if we wanted to take these clumps and clump them into bigger clumps, the way that we can layer this is by adding another clump node, convert the strands to fibers, and use those for clumping. By using a convert node, in order to convert the groom strands to fibers, you set the conversion type. So right now what we're going to use is convert strands to fibers, so we can leave that as its default. Connect the groom node into its first input and connect the geometry import into its second input. So now if we make this the root, we can see that the guides are now fibers. We can create a new clump node, or we can copy and paste the one that we already have if we wanted to carry over the values that we've already set here. So let's see what we get with a duplicate of the original clump node. So we want to keep the groom flow on its first input and then use the newly created fibers in its second input and turn that on and see what we get. So we didn't really see what happened. From the clump node, we can disable it and we can see the clumps that we created are now being clumped onto these strands. So depending on how you want to break up the clumping, you want the clump fibers to be of varying densities from low to high. But essentially, that's how clumping works. What I want to do now is fix the clumping along the part. By creating an attribute on the groom node, I'm going to use it to remove clumping from the part area. So let's turn on the clump node 1. Go ahead and name this clump level 2 and clumping level 1. So what I want to do is use the paint attribute option to use these strands in this area to remove the clumping. The way that I'm going to do that is select the groom, go into attribute paint, and create an attribute. Let's call it clump level 2 weight. That's a very long name, so let's name it clump level 2 weight. Now, if we double click clump level 2, by default, the value of all the strands is 1, so we want to leave that as is. Select the paint tool, set the value to 0, and paint a value of 0 along the part. What we're going to do is use the values of influence of the strands on the fibers and drive that information into the clump node. So what we want to do is add those values before the clump node. So let's select the comb node, create an attribute node. And since we're pulling information from the groom node, what we want to do is connect the groom node into the attribute node and turn on sample groom. The groom attribute that we're going to be pulling information from is clump level 2 weight. And now we name this new attribute clump weight. Now what we're going to do is we can add this attribute in the clump node by multiplying the value of the weight with the value of the strand attribute that we created. So let's input clump weight. And what this did, essentially all the fibers that are around the strands have no clumping. And this is helpful even though we're not getting these fibers clumped. We could add them to the second clump. And the way that we can do that is in the same way. Go to the base groom, create another attribute. Let's call it clump level 1 weight. And I don't want to eliminate it completely, so I'm gonna set the value to 0.5 and paint those values on the same strands that we used before. Hide the groom, display the hair. Now again, we want this to happen before it gets to the clump node, so let's select its input, create the attribute node, connect the groom to the attribute node, sample the clump level 1 weight attribute, and I'll put this as clump weight. And then in the clump node, clump weight. And then make this clump node the root. And now we can see that the hair that was eliminated from the clumping on this level is now being clumped down here. Now we can turn this off and see what's happening and bring it back. So now we have the clumping and we were able to fix the clumping along the part.